Okay, so now I want to talk about radical centrism and third way political economy. So, radical centrism is basically the idea that there can be approaches to politics that are outside of the typical left-right dichotomy. It's the notion that dichotomy is essentially false, and that you can borrow ideas from the left and from the right and form a coherent political philosophy, or have a coherent approach to politics without being either on the left or the right. Third way approaches to political economy, they're similar to centrism in that they try to go beyond false dichotomy. So third way approaches to political economy see that there's capitalism and there's socialism, and they think that this is a false dichotomy and that there can be approaches to political economy that are neither capitalist nor socialist, or even that are the best of both. The terms left and right come from the French Revolution, referring to the side of Parliament that people sat on. They designate certain trends or tendencies of thought. The left was for revolution, for democracy, for egalitarianism, for change, and against authoritarianism. The right was opposed to revolution, was for law and order, for peace and stability. They were suspicious of democracy or opposed to democracy. They were suspicious of egalitarianism or even opposed to egalitarianism. And they tended to respect authority and value tradition over change. Frederick Bastiat and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon both sat on the left, but their ideals were very, very far apart. Proudhon was an anarchist, and not really a market anarchist, as a lot of people today claim. He was really about direct democracy and confederation. Bastiat was an advocate of laissez-faire, something that Proudhon would have been very, very much against. A person can easily be both left in some sense and right in some sense. And this is why Proudhon and Bastiat could both sit on the left in Parliament, because they were both left in some sense. I can advocate democracy and advocate equality without advocating revolution, and I can believe that order and stability are important at the same time. If I did have such a position, it would be very hard to pinpoint me on this spectrum of left and right. My views would actually be neither left nor right, or would be both left and right. My views would then be better labeled as centrism. The terms left and right are somewhat vague and nondescript. Most leftists have some rightist tendencies, and most rightists have some leftist tendencies. People on the right often support democracy, while people on the left sometimes oppose violent revolution in favor of more gradual democratic reform. People on the left sometimes agree with people on the right, and sometimes people on the right agree with people on the left more on particular issues or particular ways of thinking. If one is for social and economic change but is wary of revolution because they value peace and stability, it can be hard to pinpoint their views in terms of the left-right spectrum. Forms of traditional conservatism represented by G.K. Chesterton, Wendell Berry, and Leopold Kohr can be seen as center-right. Trends like third-way social democracy and neo-republicanism can be seen as center-left. One thing to note is that a centrist position is not necessarily a moderate position. The centrist may propose very radical and dramatic reforms, but insist that those reforms need to be implemented in a way that does not cause a period of chaos and instability in the interim. Centrism occupies the space in the middle of the political spectrum, between the right and the left. The left and right are historically defined by the French Revolution. If the political climate changes and the liberal and conservative parties of a country shift further to the left or to the right, that doesn't affect what centrism is. Centrism is not a middle ground between Republicans and Democrats. It's not a point halfway between Labor and Tory politics. It's a middle area between the left and right, as defined by the French Revolution. It's an approach to politics that thinks that it is okay to borrow ideas from both the left and the right. So, to illustrate the political spectrum, over here you have the left, and over here you have the right. The left is for revolution, for democracy, for egalitarianism or equality, and also against authoritarianism. The right, on the other hand, is against revolution. They are for law and order, for peace and stability. They tend to be suspicious of democracy or even critical of democracy. And they also tend to be suspicious of egalitarianism, even critical of egalitarianism. They also tend to respect authority and tradition. So, these are the characteristics of the left and the right as defined by the French Revolution. The center is this area in here in the middle. So some of the ideals of the center is from the left, they will take the idea that we need social change and reform. They will think that perhaps there is something wrong with the status quo. They will think that we need more democracy, more equality. They will be suspicious of extreme authoritarianism. But at the same time, they may be opposed to outright revolution and insurrectionary violence. They may prefer the stability of law and order to the instability of revolution. They may borrow from the left and the right in any number of ways. They could be more conservative, they could be more liberal, they could be center-left, center-right. But radical centrism is basically politics outside of the left-right dichotomy. Politics that can't easily be placed into either the left, the revolutionary, egalitarian, anti-authoritarian, for violent revolution and forcing social change, versus the law and order, traditionalism, respecting authority, opposing democracy and equality. So if you can't fit into either of those categories of right and left as defined by the French Revolution, then your politics can be called centrist. And it doesn't matter if the political parties in your country, what their positions happen to be. They can be far right, far left, and if their positions change, as a centrist, your position doesn't change just because other people have moved where they are on this spectrum. Centrism is still at the same place. So, for me personally, there are certain ideals of the center-left that I find appealing. There are these ideals of third-way social democrats that I find appealing. One of them is the idea of single-payer healthcare. So, markets fail when it comes to healthcare provision. There are no natural limits on there are no natural limits to what one would be willing to pay in order to keep their mother or child from suffering and dying of a debilitating illness. So there's no upper limit to what I am willing to pay for that. That means the mechanisms that keep prices in check that are at play in most of the economy, they don't apply here. So prices tend to get too high, drug prices can skyrocket. This is an area where we need the government to step in and regulate things. We need government to step in and ensure that everybody has access to healthcare. Another idea that I find appealing is the idea of universal basic income, which is an idea that is supported by a lot of third way social democrats, but also by some people on the right. Basically, everybody within the nation would get a cash payment. Every adult within the nation would get a cash payment, and it wouldn't be large enough to allow people to live in luxury, but enough for anyone to survive on. This would ensure that no one is in poverty. Everyone can afford the necessities like food and shelter. So then, of course, this is just enough money to survive on. If you want to actually be able to enjoy a higher standard of living than just basic subsistence, then you're going to have to go out and get a job to make more money. This isn't something that just allows everybody to live on the dole. So another idea that I like is land value tax. And the idea behind land value tax is it's that people should pay taxes on the value of the land that they own minus the value of the structures upon the land and the improvements. It really comes from the idea that labor should not be taxed. Income should not be taxed because people are rightly entitled to the product of their own labor. Trade should not be taxed because free exchange is a good thing. Taxes penalize the activity that is taxed. Land speculation and landlordism are non-productive activities, and it would not hurt anything to tax them. This is why we would prefer a land value tax to other forms of taxation. Now, I should note here that the ideals of land value tax and universal basic income are supported by people on the right as well. So this is not just a kind of a center-left idea, but it's also an idea shared a little bit by the center-right and even by people a little further than center to the right. So land value tax and universal basic income, for instance, are both supported by Milton Friedman. Edmund Burke, the founder of traditional conservatism, he was an advocate of land value tax. F.A. Hayek and Charles Murray both advocated universal basic income. Some of these are ideals that transcend left and right. There are also some ideas that come from the right, especially from traditional conservatism, that I find really appealing. One idea from traditional conservatism that I find appealing is natural law theory, and the notion that there is a real difference between good and evil, and the rejection of nihilism and moral relativism. I find that to be really appealing, a really good way of approaching politics. I reject some of the religious assumptions that traditional conservatives tend to throw into their natural law theory, but I think that natural law theory in itself is something that is redeemable. As far as other traditional conservative and right-wing ideas, there's the rejection of both big government and big business, and the recognition that concentrated wealth is a form of concentrated power, and that concentrated power is a danger. There's also the realization that markets, for all their imperfections, are useful and beneficial for society. There's the recognition that revolutions are bad. People die during revolutions, and human lives cannot be replaced. When you're talking about engaging in insurrectionary violence or in revolution, you have to think about what that may cost in terms of human lives and in terms of human suffering, and whether the benefits that would come from such a revolution, whether the likely benefits actually justify the suffering and death that is going to be a result of that revolution. Radical centrism and third-way political economy are honestly the most reasonable positions to hold. Unfortunately, radical centrism looks like extreme leftism in America because America is a nation of right-wing extremist basket cases. In America, centrist politics looks like far-left politics because both American political parties are right-wing. The Democratic Party is center-right, but the popularity of populist social democrats like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are shifting the Democratic Party in the direction of center-left. But the Republican Party shifted to the far right with Ronald Reagan and has become extremely far right under Trump. People like to label social democrats like Bernie Sanders as far left because they use the term socialism, but social democrats like Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez are not socialists. They may use the term socialism, but they don't actually advocate public ownership of the means of production, which means that they're not actually socialists. Instead, they are third-way social democrats. Classical Marxists and Leninists would see such third-way social democrats as represented by Sanders as being the greatest enemies of socialism and communism. It is actually a misnomer to label such people, such social democrats, as socialists because they do not advocate public ownership of the means of production. They do not advocate public ownership of land and enterprise. So figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are really part of the third way or centrist social democratic tradition that is represented by Anthony Crossland and Anthony Giddens. At the same time, traditional conservatives would have been appalled by what we are seeing with the alt-right and Trumpism. But not only that, they would have despised modern conservatism even before the Trump era. Really, conservatism since Reagan has been something that traditional conservatives would abhor. Edmund Burke was an advocate of geoism or land value tax. G.K. Chesterton advocated widespread ownership of property and criticized capitalism as an exploitative and unjust system. Russell Kirk, in the conservative mind, echoed distributist sentiments. Wendell Berry, too, echoes these sentiments. Leopold Kohr and E.F. Schumacher critique the infinite growth aspect of capitalism and argue against big business and big government. The ideals of traditional conservatism today seem too economically left for any member of the Republican Party to even consider them. The traditional conservatives also put forth a third-way theory of political economy. Just like the third-way approach to social democracy, which is a center-left approach, there is a third-way approach put forth by traditional conservatives, and this is a center-right approach. What they suggested was, rather than capitalism, where you have the means of production privately owned and wealth concentrated into the hands of the few, with the majority of people not having any ownership of the means of production. On the other hand, you have the proposal for socialism and public ownership of the means of production. And the traditional conservatives propose an alternative outside of that dichotomy. Their proposal is a system where you have private ownership of productive property, but where private ownership is distributed throughout the economy so that almost every individual owns some property. So almost every individual would either own a small business or else would own a share within a workers' cooperative or something of that nature, would own a share of some enterprise. The traditional conservative, of course, is wrong on some social issues like gay rights and women's issues because they allow themselves to be guided by religious ideology. But for the most part, they aren't wrong about political economy. So third way and radical centrist approaches are the most reasonable in my estimation. We need significant social change without the tumult of revolution. We need reform without the instability brought about by insurrection. The system is fundamentally broken, and we have to address that. But we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Political protests, civil disobedience, and radical labor movements are responsible for the social democratic course that the Nordic countries took. At the same time, there's a fine line between direct action and insurrection. People die in revolutions, and those human lives cannot be replaced. Revolutions bring instability and violent unrest. There's something to be said for Edmund Burke's argument that we ought to prefer peace and stability to chaos and unrest. Nonviolent non-resistance and civil disobedience are preferable to violent rebellion. Sometimes violence may be necessary, but it should only be as a last resort. I'm not saying don't march in the street, don't protest, or don't disobey unjust laws. I'm just saying don't think that throwing bricks through windows will accomplish anything, and also don't think that destroying the existing power structures will magically get us closer to a free and egalitarian society. Revolutions, more often than not, make society less free and less egalitarian. I also think that neo-republicanism, starting with the American founding father Thomas Paine, and as represented by modern thinkers like Quentin Skinner, Frank Lovett, and Philip Pettit, is also within this tradition. I think that third-way political economy is heavily influenced by the thought of Thomas Jefferson, especially when you look specifically at distributism as a third-way approach to political economy. And I'd also say that Benjamin Franklin can be seen as an archetypal radical centrist.